Dan Mozersky enjoyed a long and fruitful career in the retail book industry. As a founding member of Indigo Books and Music's executive team, he was instrumental in turning the company's vision into reality. During the 1990s, he served as a manager of U.S. operations for Classic Books in New York. Prior to this, he founded and owned a chain of retail bookstores in Ottawa and Montreal. Active in the Canadian Booksellers Association, he served as director, vice president, and chair of various industry committees. In 1985, he was recognized by the Canadian Book Publishers Professional Association as Bookseller of the Year. We start off by talking about his work with the Canadian Booksellers Association and then about his time helping to build Indigo Books in Canada. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you for having me. So the Canadian Booksellers Association for many years held a booksellers course, consisted of either 3 or 5 days, and neophyte booksellers and some experienced booksellers could come and learn the basics of the industry. So I was involved in the CBA at that time, but on a kind of consultancy basis or advisory basis. And whoever was supposed to lead the bookselling school at that time either canceled or didn't come through, and I was called in a panic by, I believe, Serge Lavoie, although it might have been Ingrid Van Rotterdam, doesn't matter, whoever the executive director was at that time, and said, would I mind stepping in and organizing the bookselling school? So they gave me some curriculum materials, and then I put together more curriculum material, put together a syllabus, a daily schedule, and then engaged various people to come in and give a session on computerization. Someone would come in and give a session on accounting for booksellers, dealing with customers, publisher relations. So it was, as I had mentioned previously, part of my interest in professionalizing the book trade. And people did get, I think, a little certificate that's saying I've completed bookselling course number 1, and very sociable. So there was drinks and a dinner afterwards. And so I did that, I believe, for 3 years.
What did you want them to go away with?
That this was an important professional activity that was different from other kinds of retail. And I've sort of been giving a bit of thought to this, given our previous conversation, about sort of what it is that's different about bookselling and what it is that interests us. And, and look, it starts, I think, with a love of reading, a didactic interest in sort of spreading that to other people and sharing that with other people. I also come from an era where there was a canon of literature, and there were distinctions.
Dead white males. There we are. Let's get it out in the open here.
Yeah, there were distinctions made in culture and popular culture between quality, intelligent, important, and popular mass culture, and and then schlock culture, or whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
So my interest was always in better quality, challenging the mind, reading difficult things and understanding, not just literature, but all kinds of writings.
Right.
So the bookseller's role in this is, given that mind frame, to have a bookstore that is reflective of a liberal arts education or curriculum.
Yeah, like so someone could come in there and know that they're seeing some of the best, most important books that have been written, both in the past and the present.
Okay. Exactly. So you weren't just giving the books that were in popular demand, although you had to do that as well, but it was just as important to have Plato and Aristotle and Greek philosophers on the shelves as it was to have popular writers.
You were an idealist and a businessman.
As it turns out, I was clearly an idealist and almost by accident a businessman. So it was never my goal to set out to be a businessman. The small footnote here is my father was in my father and my father's family was in the retail furniture business in Winnipeg. And frankly, I worked in the business, and my father, wanted me to help. I hated it. I hated it.
Yeah.
Hated dealing with the public, hated retail. And of course, the irony is that I ended up in retail.
Right. Retail with a twist, though.
With a twist, right. So add in the element of idealism. My ambition never was to make a lot of money, but as it turns out, we were successful. So that was one thing I wanted to impart to those students. And the other thing was just, you can do it better, like you can do it right in sort of running a business, or you can do it sloppily and do it wrong. And so you need to be aware of certain key things. And that's what we try to impart in this curriculum. Right. So for example, the financial statements part was run actually by Chris Keene, who at that time was working at Britnell's.
Famous,
wonderful guy. So he did that first year session on financials. I learned more about financials from Chris Keene than I learned from my accountant. He was crystal clear, the importance of keeping records, the importance of financial statements, of inventory control and inventory turns. So those were the kinds of things that we tried to impart. And also dealing customer service. So we emphasize customer service, train people how to, even sort of use these little mock scenarios or little dramas of, I'm a customer, I come in, I complain, how do you handle it?
Yeah.
So I did that and enjoyed it. Yeah, so that was the book selling part of it, the book selling school part of it.
Okay, and then you also lobbied on behalf of the Booksellers Association, the federal government, regarding copyright.
No, GST.
It says in your resume, it says copyright.
Does it say copyright?
It sure does. And buying around.
Oh yeah, that was a little earlier. That's true. I was involved in that committee. You're right. I have forgotten that. So buying around was a big issue, right? So this was
even in the 90s.
Yeah, even in the 90s, because it was there was lots of pressure, particularly from the chains, to be able to buy outside of the usual agency agreements.
What's that mean?
So a Canadian publisher or agent would contract with a foreign publisher to be the sole distributor of their books in Canada.
Yep.
That was okay when it worked, but when it didn't work, it was a disaster. So sometimes it didn't work because there might be, for example, significant backlist that the Canadian agent did not keep in stock. So if it was a British publisher and you wanted a book or special ordered that book, you sometimes might have to wait 6 or 8 weeks to get the book. So delivery times were terrible. There might be a situation where rights were in dispute, or not so much dispute as that British publisher might have British rights, which the Canadian agent had, but the book came out prior in the United States.
It was a question of getting it as fast as you can for your customer.
Exactly. Yeah. Not infrequently would there be a lead review in the New York Times, or major publicity in the States. Customer would come in and say, I want, this book. I just read a review. And you'd say, not available in Canada, because the British publisher had Canadian rights. And then there was beginning the pressure from wholesalers. So this is now when people like Ingram and Baker and Taylor are starting to, so these are the single source wholesalers in the United States at that time. There were other ones, but those were the two big ones. And they cater to the trade, to the retail trade. And they were now seeing Canada as a market where they could sell books directly into. And so retailers were starting to order from them. So in this scenario, for example, of where a book had British rights and was coming out in the fall, but the American edition came out in the spring, many a bookseller would place an order with the US wholesaler and bring it into the country to satisfy their customer demand. So these became, well, basically copyright issues, right? But not copyright in that traditional sense of, someone stealing the work, but sort of where was it made more available and more readily available?
And who had rights to Canada?
Right, exactly. So I don't remember quite how that was resolved, not satisfactorily, if I remember correctly. I do remember, now it's sort of now coming back to me. So this is where the various associations, the ACP, the CBPC, a couple of other Authors Association, Booksellers Association, and I don't know that I was the chair of this committee. I don't remember. I don't think I was, but I do remember my recommending they hire a mediator. He was a mediator from Ottawa, actually, a professional mediator who we brought to Toronto, and we held meetings. And I think we sort of came to an agreement. And the agreement was roughly that you were allowed to import sort of single copies within kind of restrictions. And then for some reason that fell apart, and I don't remember for the life of me why that fell apart.
I wonder where we are now. Do you know?
Honestly, I think it's open borders now.
Okay.
I don't think anyone would have any problems bringing books in directly from the US or the UK. Anybody can order from Amazon there's no copyright restrictions.
Yeah.
I can order the British edition of a book from Book Depository, or I can order the American edition or a Canadian edition if one exists. I don't think anybody would ever say boo to a bookseller who's doing it in a serious way. Indigo, my guess is that Indigo does a lot of business with, maybe not today, but certainly did a lot of business with those US wholesalers.
Yeah. So you were a consultant then, and this is what you were doing until 1996. So what happened in 96?
So just to go back a little bit, I'll try and be brief. And this sort of fits in a bit with what we were talking about in terms of the zeitgeist to kind of understanding what was going on. 93 and 94, I took a contract in New York City to run a book business down there. So for a year and a half or 18 months, I actually lived in Manhattan, had an apartment on the Upper West Side.
That's pretty decent.
Every Canadian's dream. And I was very lucky. I was paid in US dollars. Quite a complicated situation for a variety of reasons. I was paid well, not extravagantly, but I was paid well and given the opportunity to run a business in Manhattan and live there. And so my wife commuted. So we still had our youngest child was in her last year of high school. Okay. Needless to say, she had a great last year of high school. Yeah. She had the house and 2 cars and access to our bank accounts. Okay. So what was happening in late 93, maybe early 94, is Barnes & Noble opened the Superstore at 82nd and Broadway in Manhattan. So I watched this phenomenon being in the States and saw this Superstore rollout unfold. So I wasn't at the opening day of that store, but I was there a week later. I don't know if you've remembered or been there.
It's on the square there? What's the name of that square?
No, it's not. That's not Union Square and not Columbus. No, it's on 82nd and Broadway. Right, and I believe it was the first really conceptualized, Superstore. Yeah. I think they'd already been opening suburban stores across in other parts of the country, but this was the first big one in New York, 2 levels, I don't know, probably 40 or 50,000 square feet. And again, going back to remember what I said about working at Classic, the paperback shop, and there was every poetry title. Well, it was kind of like that on a grand scale. And the
Right.
store was, of course, unbelievably successful, like, packed all the time,
Right.
lined up at the cash register. It was obvious to me that this was not only a great bookstore, but that this was where the future of retail bookselling lay. This is 93. And from there on, came back to Canada in 94, late 94, observed this superstore phenomenon, which had not yet started here in Canada. I tried on 2 separate occasions to create a superstore business, one with the late Bert Loeb from Ottawa. I don't know if you know the name.
Yes, they used to have the supermarkets.
Exactly. So Bert and I formed a partnership. We were negotiating a lease in, believe it or not, Pinecrest Shopping Center,
Okay.
where there is now a very large Chapters. And that fell apart. But that was exactly the concept. Was the super? He was sort of the money, financial, real estate. I was the book selling part.
Right.
For a variety of reasons, we could not agree on a successful partnership agreement, and that fell apart. And Bert, God bless him, was not the easiest guy in the world to work with or for.
Right.
Which he may have said the same thing about me, but for a variety of reasons that didn't work out. And then I tried with Barbara Allen and Wayne Oakley in Kingston of Printed Passage Books. In fact, we took a trip to New York to look at the superstores, and then came back and again found a space in downtown Kingston, and we're going to open up a superstore. And again, that didn't work. I think Barbara and Wayne kind of got cold feet, didn't feel they could make the financial commitment. So then, still doing a bit of consulting, we decided to move to Toronto. Kids had gone and left the nest, moved to Toronto. And so moved to Toronto late 95, December 95. And about 2 or 3 months later, I got a call from Boston Consulting.
Oh, yeah.
They wanted to come in and interview me about the book business. So just a bit of the history here is that Heather Reisman had wanted to bring Borders to Canada.
Right.
This
was Chapters was already up and running then.
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. Okay. Right. So this would have been 95, end of 95, early 96.
Okay.
So I think by 95, she had already made application for Borders to join, like in a partnership, and the government turned her down. Right. So it was a cultural industry. They reviewed it and they said it was not in the interest of the book industry. Larry Stevenson had already bought Smith Books.
Yeah.
Okay. But had not yet opened his first store. So I went down to Boston Consulting, spent 3 or 4 hours with them.
Just as far as Heather with Borders and the government saying no, she would have owned 20%. If she had have owned 50% or 60%, would the government have said yes? Or was she just bringing the franchise to Canada?
I think she wanted to own 100%. In other words, if I know.
No, I understand that, but the government then would have said, sure, because she's Canadian.
Now that you ask the question, I don't remember the percentages. I don't remember. Yeah, I honestly, I don't remember. It seems likely that she did not have a majority.
I mean, the government wouldn't have accepted it if if it was less than 50%, I'm thinking.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I know that may have been the reason on which they hung the decision.
Yeah.
But it was more about the dominance or allowing an American entry into the Canadian marketplace. So it was
Right.
less about percentage as it was about we're just a cultural protection, or as much as
Sure.
in my memory.
Or
So
maybe there would have been safeguards or something the government was looking for to ensure that Canadian publications got ample exposure.
yeah, I'm if I knew, I've forgotten. I don't know the answer to that. I think there were all kinds of issues. Supply was a big issue. So I think Canadian publishers were concerned that Borders would start supplying itself from the States. But I don't know that. I wasn't involved in those details. Okay. All I know is she had been denied it and then decided to do a study of the Canadian book trade. And she engaged Boston Consulting to undertake that study for her.
Very good. Okay.
Okay. And that's how I got called in to give some information or, talk about basically the kinds of things we were talking about and what was going on in the States and my experience. And then, so that would have been like March, end of February, beginning of March of 96. Mm-hmm. And within weeks, I got a call from Heather saying, would I come down? She wanted to talk to me. So never knew Heather Reisman, but Jerry Schwartz is from Winnipeg.
Oh, goodness. There's the mafia again. The Winnipeg mafia strikes again.
But I never knew. Jerry's older than I am. And you know how, when you're at that, 6 months can be like a decade when you're growing up.
Yeah, it is.
And I never knew him, but I never used that. And there was never any influence or connection. It's possible that when Heather said to Jerry, I just talked to Danny Mozersky, that he said, oh, the Mozerskys from Winnipeg. I don't know that, but I'm just telling you that Jerry is from Winnipeg. I'm from Winnipeg. Our paths never crossed. So anyways, she interviewed me, liked me, and hired me right away, brought me on as a consultant to begin with. And I never know how to describe myself, Nigel. But I guess founding executive is not someone else. Someone else came up with that and said I was a founding executive.
That describes that you were there to help establish the presence. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was actually physically the first person who we had. The first offices were at BCE Place downtown here. So I actually was the first executive and employee that started, although I was not the first hire. The first hire, I think, was a guy by the name of Ralph Peter, no longer alive, unfortunately. Wonderful guy, Ralph, worked for Kohl's for many years. But I think he was on holiday. He took an extended holiday, I think took his family to Europe and went on an extended holiday. He, I think, was the first hire, then I was the second, but I was the first guy who physically started, first executive. And then, I don't know. What do you want to know, Nigel?
Okay, well, here we go. It's exactly what I want to know. I want to go through your different roles and tasks and responsibilities there. So if you can just comment briefly on each one, okay?
Okay.
The first one is you conceptualized and implemented the buying philosophy for books and print-related materials, including the development of the initial inventory database consisting of over 150,000 titles.
Correct. So of that, there were 4 executives that started. There was myself, there was a marketing person, there was an IT person, and there was Ralph, who was sort of the operational person. And then I was kind of the buying book person. Okay. Heather knew very little to next to nothing about the book business, which was good for me.
Well, she loved books. That's a good start.
Loved books.
Yeah.
She loved books. So in the beginning, there was I had an office, she had an office, a couple of other people. And the first kind of weeks or month was literally conceptualizing. Indigo. So I would write little papers or little paragraphs, or we should have this kind of inventory, or our store should
Okay.
be located in the suburbs. And so that was back and forth, back and forth. And we had no inventory, and we had
Right.
no database. So don't forget, this is 1996. Computers were just starting to come into the industry. Unlike in the United States, where you could go to Ingram, for example, or Baker and Taylor, and you could go to Ingram and you say, I'm opening a 5,000 square foot store. I need, 50,000 titles, so much fiction, so much da 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 da. And 3 weeks later, they would send you a complete inventory. That didn't exist. You had to build the inventory. So I then began to hire buyers.
Okay, let's first of all get your philosophy. What was the philosophy?
Okay. In terms of the inventory, the philosophy was the best and largest selection of titles available in any bookstore in Canada.
Okay, so how do you determine best?
Again, going back to what I said about quality, types of writers. Although it was true we were a mass merchandiser, it was important that we had a section of philosophy, sociology, history that was complete, that was representative of the best writings and the classic writings of the time.
Okay.
Yep. Whatever else went on in the store, tchotchkes, gifts, coffee shop, that was not, although I was consulted on a lot of that stuff and involved in a lot of those decisions, that wasn't my responsibility. Just to give you an example, the first store we opened was Burlington, then I think Eglinton, and then Manulife. When we opened Manulife, I insisted that we have the complete Loeb Classic Library. So these little green and red hardcovers.
I know it well. It's kind of like Christmas when you put them all up.
Right. And I got pushback on this, right? Because there wasn't, it was, what do you mean we need books, Greek and Latin, and I said, if you want to be considered a serious bookstore, regardless of whether you're ever going to sell a single volume, you should have the Loeb Library.
Good for you, yeah.
And indeed, we did at Manulife.
Okay.
So they built kind of special shelves under the staircase. And there was, and you walked in that door off Bay Street, the first thing that hit you was the Loeb Library. And just to, funny how a lot of this is circle back. Remember I talked about Louis Melzack, right? And sort of how he trained me to be the, quality bookseller. But we had an opening party for that store. And he and Rose had retired and lived actually right across from where I now live, at 1166 Bay Street, which is a older apartment building with very large, very nice apartments. And we invited Rose and Louis to the opening. And Louis, who at that time was well into his 80s.
This was despite the fact he wouldn't give you the $10.
He wouldn't give me the $10, yeah.
But you invited him anyway. That's big of you.
Well said, Nigel. I have trouble holding a grudge. I honestly, in spite of the fact that he wouldn't give me the $10. And so he walked in, and the first thing he saw, this wall of Loeb, and to this day, I'll never forget, he said, "This is a good bookstore."
Very good. Did you have the Harvard University Press rep there? I hope so.
I think I did. I'm sure I did. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm sure that would have been David Stimson at that time. Yeah. The sort of the general conception in my mind, and Heather agreed with this initially, was that the Indigo Books would consist of 20 or 25 stores, not dissimilar from the Holt Renfrew model. In other words, you don't have stores everywhere, but you have a store in 2 or 3 in Toronto and downtown. You have one in Winnipeg, you have one in Edmonton, one in 2 in Montreal, and you would run them as very large independent stores. So what that meant was, for example, each store would have its own buyer. Now you'd have a head office buying, right? You'd have head office maybe buying front list. Each store would have its own resident buyer who would control the inventory, respond to local conditions, be able to say, gee, I've had, 12 requests for this title. I better get 25 more. So that was all reflected in that sort of initial model.
That's such a good model. In fact, that's exactly what James Daunt is trying to do with Barnes and Noble now.
Exactly.
Trying to get it back to that.
Exactly. Yeah. Not easy to do because you've got this kind of tension between centralized buying and independent buying. It's not easy to do, but it can be done. But certainly those initial stores were set up that each did have its own buyer. I don't know when that disappeared or why that disappeared. There's all kind of politics that then entered into it. So I started to hire buyers. One or two we took from Chapters, a couple from Leichmann's, and various other people who had been recommended to me. Ralph was very influential and helpful in that because he knew those buyers well. I didn't because I was from Ottawa, so most of those turned out really well. We hired a great business and computer book buyer from Kohl's. David Goodman was his name.
These were the national buyers, or did you spread them out across?
Well, so we hadn't opened a store yet, right? Didn't have an inventory. We had no database.
Incidentally, sorry, I just recently interviewed Doug Manette. Does his name come into it or not?
No, not till later. So the dilemma was, how do you build a database of 150, 200, 300,000 titles, all of which would then have to be entered on their own, each title. You couldn't go to the States because they had often different ISBN numbers. So I couldn't go to Ingram and say, give me 100,000 titles and convert it to Canadian, because we go back to this old copyright, a penguin here is not a penguin there.
Our penguins got more feathers?
They have,
colder up here?
They have different ISBN numbers. That's what they have.
Okay.
So I went back, and I don't know where I got the idea from. I knew Printed Passage Books, my friends Wayne Oakley and Barbara Allen, who I had trained originally at Prospero Books, had an up and running database of about 150,000 titles. So I said to Heather, why don't we buy Printed Passage? Get Wayne and Barb on as managers, and we'll get their database and we'll lock up Kingston. So they could even run Printed Passage still for a while. We bought them. I don't remember the price. I don't think it was a lot of money, but it was sort of, they bought probably their pension. She did do that negotiation. I sort of opened the door and said, but I was not involved in the negotiation because it would have been a conflict. And anyways, we took over their database, and that's what we started with. And then the buyers, who at that time worked in one large room all together at BCE Place, then they just started adding titles, right? But at least you had this core that went back 15 years of basic inventory, all Canadianized, all Canadian ISBNs, all with proper data descriptions. And that's what we started with.
Okay. So let's look then at initiating, developing, and negotiating terms, including co-op, with leading Canadian publishers and suppliers.
Right.
What that involve?
So there were these four key executives: Kirsten Chapman, Michael Gagne, Ralph Peter, and myself. And we needed a finance person. Okay. So I knew Carl Fine, who had worked at Kohl's as a vice president of finance. When Larry Stevenson bought Kohl's, he let all of the Kohl's executives go and kept the Smith executives, rightly or wrongly, another sort of discussion. And Carl was wasn't the chief financial officer. I think his title was vice president of finance, but he was their financial guy. And he was out of a job. So interesting, we go back to the borders, Heather trying to bring borders in.
Yeah.
Barnes and Noble also had their eye on Canada, and they hired as consultants 3 former Coles executives to build a database, kind of start looking at titles, teaching them about the Canadian industry. One of them was Carl. The other was the late Lenny Berger. And the third, his name is just on the tip of my tongue, but it doesn't matter. And they were kind of paid as consultants, and they traveled back to the States and came here and reported. And then I don't know whether that fell through or they weren't going to proceed. And Carl was at loose ends. And I brought Carl into the organization. I said to Heather, we need a finance person, or maybe she said to me, and I introduced Carl to Heather, and Heather hired Carl. And so Carl had been working at Coles for, 30 years, 25 years. So yeah, indeed, after we started to build this database, we needed to start negotiating with suppliers.
Yeah, so what about the co-op? Talk about
so Carl and I, we made a long spreadsheet of all the publishers, key names, and the items that we wanted to negotiate.
Okay.
And we set up meetings with them. And usually he and I, but sometimes I would do it on my own, but mostly he and I would then meet with the president of Random House, or,
Simon
Francis Hall or Collins, right? And sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, no, I was just coming up with names. I mean, there's the big 5, and then of course there's the independents, but I don't know if you did much work with them at all.
We did all of them. We basically did almost all of them, all of the distributors, William Collins, the big ones, Penguin, Random House.
You did the independent Canadian publishers as well?
Independent Canadian, right?
Okay.
And we went in and we said who we were, Heather Reisman, obviously there'd been a lot of press, and we were here to negotiate our terms. So I'm going to say at this time, Chapters might have opened their first store in Burlington.
So really, the 2 companies were starting up almost at the same time. I had the impression that Indigo started up quite a bit later than Chapters.
No later than a year. And Of course, our first store was in Burlington, which was as well.
But you wanted to go head to head.
Well, so here's a bit of a difference of opinion. I was involved in a lot of the real estate because I knew quite a bit about locations and real estate, but I was not involved in that real estate decision. I believe it was Jerry Schwartz's decision.
Right.
And I always felt it was a mistake.
Why is that?
Because I never thought you wanted to open a war with your major competitor from day one, because you essentially were setting the terms of your relationship from that moment. So
good for the consumer.
Good for the consumer, maybe. I don't know that it necessarily was good for the consumer.
Well, if you're going to be competing on price, it is.
But we weren't really competing on price at that point, to be honest with you. We were discounting the bestsellers. I think we had a reward program where you could get 10 points off, backlist or anything else. But it wasn't an all-out war. It was a real estate war. It was a real estate war. It wasn't a price war.
What does that mean?
It means that you were jockeying for the best locations.
Right. Okay.
So you were trying to, like real estate chess, you were trying to win a greater or better location than your competitor.
Right. And better location is what? One with more footfall?
Pretty much. More foot traffic, higher visibility, possibly greater layout, better relationship with your community. And we did go head to head. As the next sort of 4 years that I was there, we were often in, Chapters was there. Well, okay, we didn't want to be here because they were there, or vice versa. Or you were dealing with the same landlords. They would get, we would be negotiating, we would lose it, and they would get it, or vice versa.
Right. What about the co-op?
Oh, co-op. Okay. The co-op. So there's the things we negotiated. Discount.
Yeah.
So almost all publishers said, we'll give you our top discount. Even though you haven't opened a store yet, but we recognize that, you will eventually have 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 stores. You will be a main competitor to Chapters, and we'll give you, at that point, it was like sort of 45 or 47% discount.
Okay.
Co-op was hit and miss. It wasn't a consistent, we need 3%, that we're going to put into promotion. It was often left as to be negotiated on a title basis or a promotion basis. We hadn't yet worked out all the details about table placement or paying for space in the store. So that was a bit ad hoc, both for the publisher as well as for us.
What typically would you do if they want to promote a book? So how much they pay for shelf space or table space? Did it vary from publisher
to publisher? It varied from publisher to publisher.
Was it a percentage?
Traditionally, it was a percentage of your sales.
Okay.
2%, 1%, 3%.
Right.
That's long gone. That's a thing of the past. Because the balance of power was shifting from the publisher to the retailer.
Right.
When Chapters opened up each of their stores, I remember Jack Stoddart saying, like the guy was orgasmic. They were buying more books than he could ever imagine anyone would ever buy. So when they began to ask for higher discounts, more co-op, easier returns, so that was something else we negotiated. So each publisher had a returns policy.
Yeah, can you explain that? What do you mean by easier?
So returns policies, were traditionally structured. It starts in the 30s when publishers during the Depression couldn't get their books into stores. Someone said, let's offer them, make them returnable. That way booksellers will be more
to taking them.
Yeah, more exactly. So the standard kind of return policy was you needed to keep the book for a certain period of time, usually 3 months. You needed to request permission to return a book, quoting the invoice number and when it was purchased. And it could not be returned beyond 12 months. So you had a window of from 3 to 12 to return it. And then some publishers, although not necessarily published, had a policy whereby they would limit the total amount of returns that you could actually send back. So it might be a percentage. You couldn't buy 100 books and send back 90. You might do it once, but the publisher might then say, look, we're disallowing this return. And they would sometimes call you up. So sometimes you'd get, not at Indigo, but in previous previous retail, you'd sometimes get a call, or at the end of the year, if a publishers were reviewing your sales, they'd, pull out an old spread, they'd say, okay, well, you did $28,000 worth of sales with us, and it broke down into hardcover, paperback, and children's books, and you returned 32%. And they'd say, oh, yeah, that's pretty good. Or they'd say, gee, you returned 48%. That's a problem. Those were the kinds of things that were in place as returns policies that the publishers insisted the booksellers adhere to. Again, we think about this shifting of the balance of power. Booksellers clearly said, not going to happen. We'll return a book in 2 weeks if we need to. We're not going to quote an invoice number. We're not going to wait. We don't care about the condition. And not only that, you're going to have to give us 3 extra bonus points for us processing the return, or some, pick up, make something up. And so not only are you going to give us back, the regular discount, we're going to get a 3-point pickup.
For what? There's,
Indigo, for example, and I'm sure other chains do this. In the old world, you'd order 100 books from Random House. The books would come into your store or warehouse, and you'd open up the box, and there'd only be 98 books. So you'd write to the publisher, we're short shipped 2 books. Please credit our account, or please reship those books. So now the warehouses, they don't do any of that, right? It's all done by scanning. No one counts a book. The skid comes in, you scan it, and the bookseller tells the publisher, we assume there's going to be a 2% error factor.
Automatically.
And we're going to deduct that when we make our payment.
Right.
So it could be, for example, an invoice error. So sometimes you'd catch, they gave you the wrong discount, or they gave you, the price was wrong. So this covers all of those sins. You don't have to do the manual operational labor.
That's done.
But it's another way of taking money from the publisher and putting it into your pocket.
Okay.
Carl had a very high reputation in the business because he was a finance person for Kohl's.
Right.
And Kohl's didn't like to pay its bills. So all these publishers knew Carl, right?
Right. They didn't like Carl.
They loved him. Charming guy.
Did you say that Kohl's had a reputation for paying or not?
Not paying.
And they still loved him.
Carl charmed the pants off them, right?
Okay.
He's that kind of guy. So they all knew him, right? And I say that sincerely. Carl is a good friend of mine. He is very charming. Obviously I had a reputation as well. So they all knew me. So
as charming as well?
No, I was not that charming.
No, okay.
But I had here's what I think I had. I think I had a reputation for integrity.
That's a good reputation.
Okay. And I had a reputation for knowledge about the industry and concern for the industry. So those were things that Heather didn't have. That is to say, they didn't know her in that way. So when Carl and I
it's not that she didn't have a reputation for integrity.
No, that's not what I'm saying. They didn't know her.
She had no reputation with them. They didn't know her.
Exactly. Right.
Okay.
So Carl and I played an important role in those negotiations by introducing ourselves as that part of the business that knew the business. They were more confident that this wasn't going to be a fly-by-night, that there were people with experience and integrity who knew what they were doing, and they were going to run that part of the business.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
So then you rolled out 7 stores with them.
Yeah. So that was latterly in my career with Indigo. So my main role was to sort of run the print part of the business.
What does that mean?
So there were other aspects to the business. There were the cafes. There was the non-book.
You mean the book part?
I mean the book and magazine part and remainder part, right? So the print, she called it print. She likes fancy titles, sure. That's fine. But I also set up the first warehouse that we had. It's only 23,000 square feet. But as we started to open stores, we needed a staging warehouse. So I opened up on St. Regis Crescent here, rented 23,000 square feet of warehouse, hired people for that. So I did that initially.
The publishers used a distribution company, did they? So the distribution company was General, is that right? And they shipped you the books? Is that how it worked?
Well, only for General. That is to say, most publishers, complicated answer, many of the large publishers had their own warehouses.
And so they shipped to your warehouse directly?
Well, I'll get back to that in a second. Other publishers, so we go back to this agency business. The Canadian publishing industry was started as an agency business.
That's right. They were
Oxford didn't publish Canadian books in 1932, nor did Macmillan. They set up a Oxford Canada, and they were the importer of Oxford books. And then they also, many of them took on other lines and became agents for those. So,
and they would often just put their own title page, and that's all they did. They used the sheet.
Or if it was a Canadian edition, or not
Yeah.
even that, right? They would just straight import.
Right.
General publishing was just, I mean, they did their own publishing program, but they were largely a distributor of other publishers.
Exactly. Is it Stoddard?
Yeah, Jack Stoddard. So there's Jack Stoddard Sr., who by that time was out of the business and may not even have been alive. And Jack Stoddard Jr. was running General Publishing, which originally had been General, Musson, and McLeod, and then amalgamated under the name General Publishing and General Distribution, or General Publishing Distribution. His idea was to get all these small Canadian publishers. And look, and I've been a publisher. Warehousing and distribution in this country is unbelievably expensive. It's obvious. The geography of the country is against you. So his idea was that he would get all these guys under one roof. He would do the sales and the marketing, or he would do some of that for them, but he would basically do the warehousing and the distribution, and then he'd get these huge economies of scale. Right. That's the theory. Of course, it didn't quite work out that way. So if I was ordering, let's say we were ordering an Anansi title, you know, you might order that from the Anansi rep, or you might order it from the General rep. If it was distributed by General, it would come from the General warehouse. But there was no one large central warehouse or distributor. Many had their own. Thomas Allen had its own, Fitzhenry and Whiteside, Collins, Simon and Schuster, although Simon and Schuster might have been with General or something at that point. But anyways, you know, there were lots of distributors.
It wasn't just a one-stop shop, you're saying. There was General that had maybe 20 or 30 or 40, and the rest they did it themselves?
Yeah, I don't know that number is accurate. No, General would not necessarily have been the biggest. Penguin, Random House, Collins, what now is Hachette, Little Brown.
But Dan, those are big separate companies. The General would have captured a lot of the smaller ones, right?
Correct. The smaller Canadian publishers. Yeah. Well, they would have also had some large US and British publishers.
Okay.
That they'd had traditionally for years. But then this idea came in the mid 90s, maybe the late 90s, where Jack Jr. said, let's become the distributor for Canadian small presses. Okay. And then when he went bankrupt, partly because of Chapters,
that's what I want to.
That's when, you know, all those guys got into trouble, like Key Porter and all those guys sort of lost their inventory. But I do want to go back to this warehouse business just for a second. Okay. I was never in favor of a retailer having a warehouse. I always logistically believed that the publisher who already has a warehouse with those books in it should act as your warehouse.
Well, in other words, they can ship directly to your different shops, right?
Bingo.
Yeah.
At no cost to us. No labor, no warehouse, no inventory.
Okay, direct. So the reason that Indigo set up its own warehouse was to get stuff in from the States, is that it? Or what? So why'd they set it up?
I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I don't honestly know the answer, other than it happened. I was pushed out of the warehouse, for example.
You're pushed out of that being your responsibility?
Correct. Okay. Correct. Now, along with this, Indigo was building internet business. So again, I was not directly involved in those decisions. Somewhere along the line, executives, not me, so she was already now bringing in more senior people from other industries who said, we need our own warehouse. In order to build this internet model, we need our own warehouse. And all I remember one day is I was up at the warehouse on St. Regis, and Michael Gagne, who was then in charge of IT and operations, came in with a new guy, a senior logistics guy, and said, get rid of Ron, your warehouse manager. We'll get him a job someplace else and close this down. And we've, opening up a warehouse someplace else. And it was a fait accompli. I had nothing to do with it. I was not part of that decision-making process. And look, if your model is 200 stores, maybe you need a warehouse. If your model is 25 independent stores run as independent stores, I would have continued to argue from a logistics point of view, what do you need a warehouse for? You may need a warehouse for some things.
Right.
You may want to bring something in bulk and then break it down. If Penguin has all those books in the warehouse, what the hell are you bringing those books over and putting them in your warehouse?
Yeah, doesn't make sense.
So what else is on your list? What else did I do?
No, I think I'm more interested in knowing what happened with General. So what happened?
I'm trying to remember. So Chapters opened up its own warehouse called Pegasus.
Right.
Gee, I'm trying to remember what it was that brought General down, and I'm not sure I do remember. Honestly, I'd have to kind of refresh my memory. It seems to me that it had a lot to do with returns. Pegasus was emptying its warehouse or had gotten into trouble, like Chapters had gotten into trouble and was returning stock. Jack was paying out the publishers in 60 days, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay. So Key Porter would have shipped in books to General, and within 60 days, Jack would have paid Key Porter. Chapters was returning books in 30 days, and therefore there was a cash flow shortfall, if I remember correctly. And I don't remember what else was going on in the industry at that time, but basically he was overextended and he ran out of money.
Yeah, because one of the versions is that Indigo returned, or maybe this was when Indigo took over Chapters. I guess we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but but basically it was all these truckloads full of returns that came back, and then General couldn't get them back to the publishers, and the publishers had to go there to try and recoup their own books. And
that I'd have to check the sequence, and I wonder if McSkimming doesn't cover this in his book, The Perilous Trade.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, I don't remember actually.
Yeah, I think he does. I don't think it was Indigo. I think this happened before Indigo took over Chapters.
Why are some of these Canadian independent publishers so pissed off with Heather then?
I don't have an answer other than she's not representing their books. The only answer I can think of is their books are not being represented. Look, I left in 2000. Okay, I was there for 4 years, just shy of 4 years.
Right.
They didn't buy Chapters till the following year, I think till 2001.
Okay.
So I was not there for the Chapters purchase or amalgamation. My buying philosophy was, as we've discussed, represent important books from important publishers, represent small publishers, independent publishers, represent university press titles. Very important. Princeton, Harvard, University of Toronto Press, McGill, Queens, very important. Look, and I'm not saying this was because after I left, they changed their buying policy, but they changed their buying policy.
Right.
And if you go in today to any Indigo or Chapter store, I don't think you'll find a university press title. And I know for a fact from David Stimson, who was their rep for many years, major university, US university press rep and U of T, they did no business. They did zero business with Indigo. Like Indigo did not buy university press titles.
But maybe that's because they couldn't sell any of them.
You know what I say to that? I say, crap. That's a load of crap. They didn't stock them because they didn't think that was their customer base for whatever reason, or they didn't understand the customer base, or they didn't understand those books, or they didn't understand those authors. And you can go into an Indigo and go to their fiction section, and you'll have all the mass market and all the trade popular titles. Go find a literary Canadian title.
You'll have 50 shades of them.
They'll have 55 shades of them.
Right.
So,
Okay.
hey, so I don't know what publishers, small independent publishers today are saying about Indigo, but I would say certainly in the early, aughts and 2010 and 2012 and 2015, those books were not represented in Indigo or Chapter stores. The general fiasco and bankruptcy was the problem for small publishers who owned the inventory.
That's right.
Right?
They lost big bucks.
Big bucks because was it theirs? Was it the receivers? Was it, and then who could sell it? And then who, when can you get it? If you could get it at all. It certainly wasn't about payment, because I do clearly remember that he paid publishers more quickly than he actually received the money from the bookseller.
Oh, Stoddard, yeah.
Yeah, Stoddard, right. Other than that, I'd have to honestly refresh my memory about the general bankruptcy and general publishing bankruptcy and why that happened. Sorry, I'm not.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
And I just know that it's a very sad sort of part of Canadian book publishing history.
Yes.
And I guess the other thing is, just bringing it up to today, if it's very difficult to sell Canadian independent publishers' books to Canadians or not, that's the question. Like, does Indigo carry them? And if so, do they make an effort to sell them, or what?
Yeah, I don't have any insight to that today, other than as a consumer, when I go into their stores, I don't find those books there.
And as a bookseller, if you had stayed there, you would continue to carry a good selection of small independent Canadian publishers.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what, just have we covered off your different roles there? Is there anything else?
Yeah, so then, no, then I did end up, so sort of this buying role, head of the print department. The company was growing, so internet was there and big warehouse and all kinds of executives being brought on. Then by the third year, we'd had, I think, about 12 stores. So 98, 99, 12 stores. And she came to me one day. God, I sort of remember exactly where we were when we had the conversation. Anyways, it was, I don't know, the head of construction had quit or left. And Dan, would I take over construction? And to my regret, I said yes. It was a big mistake. Not because I didn't think I could do it, but because the thing about working for Heather, you're okay if she doesn't know a lot about your area of expertise. So, for example, the book business, she had pretty fixed opinions about publishers and about the book business, but she didn't really know the ins and outs of, for example, negotiating and doing the things that we did and building a database and some of the operational stuff. Not that you could get away with stuff. It was that she wouldn't come in and yell at you and say, who bought this blue book? Or why did you buy a pink book? So I was kind of safe. Construction was an area where if it involved color, trust me, you were screwed. Color, if a wall is not painted once, it's painted 48 times till the color is right. So it was an area where she liked to mix in. Anyways, I took over that job. Me and Louis was my junior. I don't know, he was about 24 years old, and he was my my assistant. And we built 7 stores, 7 superstores in the last year that I was there. Now, I didn't build them. Obviously, we had architects and contractors, but I was in charge of that construction.
And the design of the floor space and everything?
So she had some input into that, but, she was a busy person, and we would get the okay on some things. So here was the problem. You design one store and you get the okay. You would take that footprint and put it on the same store, same layout, 2-story, departments in the same place, cafe in the same place, everything the same. The first store you open, my God, Mozersky, this is the best store I've ever seen designed. Then you go to that second store and she'd say, who the hell designed this store? Mozersky, get out of here. You're so like you never knew. You just never knew.
Exactly the same store, though, just to be clear, right?
I'm telling you, in this case, those 2 stores were exactly the same. Same format, lower level, escalator, second level, overlooking a mall. Like it was.
Yeah, but wait a minute, Dan. Maybe the colors in one city wouldn't work in the other city.
Aha! Exactly. Maybe the colors wouldn't work. What was I thinking? So that was sort of happening in the sense that I no longer felt I had control over my own area. And you would never, God bless Heather with all of her gifts, you knew you would never win. In other words, she would always have the last word.
Well, she's
okay, that's her right.
She's the boss.
She's the boss. We've established from day one that I was a lousy employee, right? So
have. If listeners can refer back to our initial conversation,
previous conversation. So maybe a miracle that I lasted 4 years, and then also, what was happening was the executives. So I was a senior vice president was my title. You were taking over more executive functions. So, for example, you'd have to prepare a budget, right? And a forecast for the next year. Well, I don't know, forecast in the book business, not easy to do.
Well, it's that's the whole definition of the book business. You really just don't know. You can't predict anything.
Right. So try putting that down on paper.
Well, you had to, right? Is that why you left?
In an executive summary to go to the board, right?
Right.
You
should have sent just a little note. How the fuck should I know?
Well, how the fuck should I know? Exactly. I'm going to continue what I'm doing. We'll buy books. Hopefully they'll sell. Yeah. And hopefully our sales will be up. That's pretty much the formula. There's you can't massage, look, and that's the other truth about book selling that you realize is booksellers are not really arbiters of taste. We're just a channel of distribution for the publishers.
I don't agree with that.
Well, it happens to be true. We can be selectors. We can be curators.
Selectors. First of all, you select what goes in the store. Second of all, you make an effort to put the best books into the most appropriate hands.
But you're starting from a publisher's catalog. And when the first page of that publisher's catalog says, first volume of Obama's memoirs, you have no influence. You're going to buy 500 or 5,000 copies of that book.
Yeah.
And for the most part, it's going to fly out of the stores. You may influence some titles. You may actually make a bestseller out of a local author. But by and large, booksellers are conduits for already predetermined, for the most part, predetermined bestsellers. You're not going to make, I don't know, who would be a good example? Not John Grisham, but another, James Patterson book. James Patterson's going to sell his 400,000 or 500,000 or million copies every year. You're going to order those books.
Yeah,
you're going to put them on the shelves.
You're contradicting your philosophy.
Yeah, well, I'm telling you that one's role is limited. So in that respect, much of what you do as a bookseller is simply a conduit for publishers' decisions. Yeah. You can change the quality of your inventory. You can carry certain types of books.
Well, you got your backlist too.
And you got your back. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. I'm not so much contradicting myself as saying there is a reality to this business.
Yes.
It's not, you're not working in a vacuum.
You were an idealist, but you're not any longer.
I'm probably not any. That's why I'm retired.
That's right. You're neither an idealist nor a realist. You're retired.
I'm retired, exactly.
Well, that's a good segue into you know what? We're going to have to do a third episode. You may want to wait for a little bit to decompress after this one. But first of all, have we covered everything off to your satisfaction?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I've said, I in spite of what I just said about, a bookseller not having much impact, I do think the crucial thing is that this is about books. Always has been for me, about a passion for books, a passion for good books and good literature, and the importance of presenting to the public a wide range of titles. And my career has been multifaceted in the book business, although largely in retail. And it's been, by and large, although not without its stresses, a very interesting career. So I think I've covered, I'd say that's most of what I want to say.
Well, we've got one more section to cover, and it's a really important one, I think, and that is the fact that you got into used antiquarian book selling, selling books on books, and that's how we got to know each other.
Right.
So let's leave that for another time. And please allow me to again thank you for, I don't think you spilled your guts entirely. I think you're holding back a little bit. But thank you for conveying to us your experience and wisdom, Dan.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me, Nigel.
Okay. Dan Mozersky is a retired bookseller, and we look forward to talking to him again about, now it was called Spadina
Road Books.
Spadina Road Books. So that'll be the third installment.
Great.
Thanks again.
Okay. Thanks, Nigel.